Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us as our webinar participants and attendees come into our tonight's presentation. I want to give you some information. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Tonight's presentation by the Historical Society of Santa Rosa is a moving story, how the St. Rose Historic District became a critical resource for saving Santa Rosa's architectural past. Tonight, our webinar, if you haven't attended one of our monthly webinars previously, will be to where our attendees are in the audience, unseen and unheard by our presenter. And after the presentation, our Q&A will be done on Zoom. You can key in your questions in the chat area, and on Facebook Live, for those of you that are joining us, you can key in your questions in the comment area, and our administrator will be relaying those questions over to us on Zoom. My name is Leslie Graves. I'll be your MC and host this evening, and I will also be facilitating the Q&A time. At this time, I see quite a few participants in our Zoom area. Thanks again for joining us. We'll be getting started soon. We're very excited this evening because we have one of our own Historical Society of Santa Rosa's board members giving our presentation. So tonight's presentation, A Moving Story, How the St. Rose Historic District Became a Critical Resource for Saving Santa Rosa's Architectural Past. We'll get started now with a little bit of a video. And this video shows the movement of one of the houses in San Francisco. That happened earlier this year. Our presenter is going to be talking about the historical way that houses were moved here in Santa Rosa. Before we get started, I want to remind everybody who's joining us here on Zoom or live on Facebook simultaneously that there will be a Q&A time to ask questions, and that'll be after our presentation this evening. Q&A on Zoom, you'll just key in your questions into the chat area, and on Facebook, you'll key in your questions into the comment area there. So now I'm very proud to present my neighbor and our presenter this evening. That's right, we're both residents right here in the St. Rose Historic District. And it's a great area to live close to downtown. And it's so much fun to learn about the history of the area that you live in. So I hope this night really gives people the motivation, not only to learn a little bit more about the St. Rose Historic District, but maybe the area that they live in as well. This evening, our presenter is none other than Denise Hill. She is a board member on the Historical Society of Santa Rosa. and resides, like I said, in the St. Rose neighborhood, where she has researched its history for more than 25 years. Denise contributes articles to the Historical Society of Santa Rosa newsletter and manages the St. Rose Historic District website, and you can find that with great resources at www.strosedistrict.org. So, with no further ado, let's jump in. Denise, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the presentation. It's going to be on homes and other structures that were moved into the St. Rose neighborhood. And while moving homes was quite common up to the early 1900s, it is a rarity these days. So it's kind of exciting to see that little video that was shown and see how they're doing it these days, and that they actually can still save older buildings by moving them. Tonight, I'll give you some history on how homes were moved and tell you about homes that were moved into the St. Rose neighborhood in downtown Santa Rosa. For those that don't know, the St. Rose neighborhood is just north of the mall in downtown Santa Rosa. Its boundaries are College Avenue to the north, 7th Street to the south, although it does dip down to 6th Street in some areas, B Street to the east, and Morgan Street near the freeway to the west. It was designated by the city as a historic preservation district in 1990. So this slide here is a very fun slide, I think. I collect these photos of how homes were moved, and these are 4 of them. And you can see people get really creative on how they're going to move a home. And there's 2 of these images here, both on the right, that are of homes that were actually moved in the Bay Area. The first image, the top right image, shows the horses, the one with the horses next to the Victorian, is in San Francisco back in 1908. And in order to move a house this way, the house would be jacked up and placed on greased beams. And as the home inched along, workers would pick up the planks and ties that were left behind and rebuild the track in front of the house. A capstan or drum was placed in the middle of the street and connected via a pulley to a huge crossbeam on the structure. And the 2 horses would circle the drum, winding the pulley, slowly pulling the home down the street. Now you can imagine how that is a rather nerve-wracking situation on the streets of San Francisco, but they got it done. The home on the barge is the Lifford House, which was built in 1876 in Mill Valley and was the home of Benjamin Lifford, who had been a doctor in the Union Army before moving west. His home was originally located at Strawberry Point as part of the Lifford Eagle Dairy Ranch. It was moved by barge to Tiburon in December of 1957 when it was threatened with demolition, and is now owned by the National Audubon Society. So why move a structure? In the 19th century and earlier, buildings were moved for economic reasons, especially in rural areas and small towns. This was due to the scarcity and expense of building materials, and possibly the scarcity and expense of skilled craftsmen in the area. Starting in the mid-20th century, the creation of cheap building materials and the proliferation of power lines meant the end of widespread house moving. In addition to changing economics, the complications of coordinating with telephone and power companies, plumbing connections, heavy traffic, and the necessity of obtaining special permits have all contributed to the present day disinclination to move old buildings, even though the cost of moving and resettling into a house can be 30 to 50% cheaper than the cost of a new home. And we know that around here. However, there are compelling reasons to move a house even today. One is to protect the environment. Demolishing a house or other structure means the majority of the building, if not all of it, will end up in landfill. Additionally, the average new structure requires 5,000 board feet of lumber, resulting in 50 trees saved per structure moved. Another critical reason is the preservation of a community's heritage. A historic home is more than just an old structure, it's a discernible link to the area's past. With each demolished historic building, we lose a piece of the past and a reminder of who we are and how we got here. So how are buildings moved? The process used in the 1800s and 1900s was not that different to the process used today. The foundation was excavated, the structure was braced underneath and then jacked up using steel rods inserted into a mechanism that would turn, raising a center shaft that would raise the building. Then sections of the foundation were removed to allow placement of the screw jacks under the sills. A large building required more screw jacks than did a small one. Next, sleds were inserted under the structure, and oxen, horses, tractors, and as we've seen, even train engines and barges were used to pull the building to the new site. The time of year was also a consideration, with many waiting for winter when it was easier to pull the sled across deep snow. Alternatively, rollers were used. They consisted of wooden carriages on wheels fastened beneath the building sills by means of spikes projecting upward from the carriage. The rollers traveled over heavy wooden timbers placed beneath the raised building. By means of a rope and pulley arrangement, the building was pulled along the timbers. As it moved forward, the timbers from behind were taken up and replaced ahead of it. This is what we saw in the earlier image of a house being moved in San Francisco. Even when gas-powered trucks were available, horses were still used because they were able to step over the large cables as they circled, a situation that could halt the truck. Today, buildings are lifted using hydraulic jacks, the rollers are steel, and the moving dollies are made of a series of truck axles. Heavy-duty commercial trucks are typically employed to move the structure. Additionally, cribbing, a method of stacking large beams in an alternating sequence shown here in the bottom image, became necessary as homes had to clear their old foundations and be raised high enough to slide onto truck beds. Starting in the early 1900s, electric wires and poles needed to be moved to accommodate a house getting relocated. In order to pass through narrow streets, buildings also might be cut in half or partially or completely disassembled. Using this method, detailed markings of each of the structural components is critical for a smooth reassembly at the building's final destination. So how early were buildings moved in Santa Rosa? In 1854, the first plat map of Santa Rosa was filed by Julio Carrillo. It included 1st through 5th Streets running east and west, and A through E Streets running north and south. Julio Carrillo's house was the first residential structure built within the town's limits, and Hammond Star the first commercial structure. In 1855, merchants from the town of Franklin moved their buildings to the new town. In 1856, the Baptist Church moved from Franklin to Santa Rosa. In 1862, a butcher shop was moved to the northeast corner of the plaza in downtown Santa Rosa. 12 years later, in 1874, the Christian church was moved from the corner of B and 4th Streets to a new site on 5th Street between A and B. It's amusing that the newspaper quote here on this slide from 1875 is speaking about how the old buildings being moved, how old the buildings were being moved, considering how young Santa Rosa was as a town at that point. So I just shared some information on buildings being moved into and within the downtown area, but when did buildings start being moved out of the downtown and other areas of Santa Rosa? This timeline shows some key factors that resulted in buildings being moved out of the downtown area. One was the 1906 earthquake, which wasn't quite as much a catalyst for buildings being moved out of downtown Santa Rosa as you would think, since so many buildings were actually destroyed. Another was the 4-lane freeway finished in 1948 that affected over 150 mostly single-family structures, or about 3% of Santa Rosa's housing stock at the time. These homes were primarily in Italian and Portuguese neighborhoods between Sebastopol Avenue and Ridgeway Avenue. By 1946, 20 homes had been moved. approximately 92 were eventually moved, and 22 homes actually destroyed. In the 1950s, the federal government's urban renewal program gave cities millions of dollars to tear down blighted areas in an attempt to restore economic viability to a given area by attracting external private and public investment. Santa Rosa embraced this program in the 1960s. 44 families and 39 businesses were relocated out of downtown. However, the city's approach resulted in much more demolition than buildings moved. Approximately 110 downtown structures were destroyed in the 1960s and 70s to make room for widening of streets, the Santa Rosa Mall, the new City Hall, library, and post office. Starting in the 1870s and continuing through the 1950s, there were also boom and bust cycles that kept house movers busy. Each time our local economy was going strong, more homes were moved out of the downtown core area to make room for commercial buildings. These homes were moved to nearby neighborhoods to make space for them. One of those neighborhoods was the St. Rose Preservation District. So who were our local building movers? Two of the more well-known movers were W Swank and the Christ family. W Swank was born in 1855. He was a native of Iowa, and he arrived in Santa Rosa in the early 1870s. Research shows he was moving structures in Santa Rosa for over 20 years, from the late 1800s up until at least 1913. The newspaper article announcing his death in 1919 stated he had a big, kind heart and was one of the best known men in Santa Rosa. This was surely his most accomplished feat was moving the Pacific Methodist College. This was in 1889 and an amazing undertaking, considering the building was a 3-story wooden structure with a cupola and was 110 feet long and 55 feet wide, and the distance it was moved was more than a mile. The Press Democrat had this to say about the move. Mr. Swank is one of the principal house movers. It was he who moved the old Methodist College from its former site to its present location, the biggest job of that kind ever undertaken here. It's a 3-story building with a big cupola, and he moved it more than a mile. He had first to secure right-of-way from all the property owners whose lands were to be traversed, and in several places, he had to move their buildings out of the way and replace them after the college had passed. Can you imagine? For a long distance, the college traveled Wright Street, which is only 2 feet wider than the building, but not a fence picket was broken. The whole job was done in 3 weeks, and the college landed at its new site without even a crack in the plaster. And near as I can tell, that college moved from College Avenue, hence the name, to Pacific Avenue. And it no longer exists, unfortunately, because it's a pretty magnificent building. The Christ family were house movers over 3 generations, moving an estimated 10,000 structures. William Christ, born in 1932, started the business, the Christ House Moving Service in Sonoma County in 1860. One of William's sons, King Christ, inherited the business, and 2 of his sons, George and Walter, were still running the business almost 100 years later when George Christ volunteered his company to move the Church of One Tree from the Ross and B Street area to Juilliard Park to make way for a new parking lot downtown. And as you can see, they had to move that church in pieces. And luckily, the move went well, and that beautiful church is still there on the edge of Juilliard Park. So why was the St. Rose neighborhood such a popular destination for so many buildings being moved? The answer lies with the Metzger and Cooper properties. The Metzger family owned 3 acres between A and B streets and bordered by the Catholic Church property on the north and 8th Street on the south. In 1902, the property only had 1 structure on it, the Metzger's house. There was also the Cooper's property, a few blocks north. Marion Cooper married into the Kloop family, who owned a large piece of property between B and Washington Street and stretching from 10th Street to Lincoln Street. In 1885, Marion Cooper purchased a 1/3 interest in Lee Brothers and Company's drayage, a trucking business located in downtown Santa Rosa. Lee Brothers used numerous wagons, trucks, and drays to move baggage, produce, and other items, along with providing a service for those moving into the area who would have their household items shipped in advance of their arrival. The Cooper property went undeveloped until the early 1920s and was most probably used to pasture horses for that drayage business. So let's get started on which houses were moved into the St. Rose neighborhood. By far, one of the most prominent and prolific movers of homes in Santa Rosa was Augusta Metzger. Augusta was the widow of William Metzger. William Metzger established the Santa Rosa Brewing Company in 1872 and later the Metzger Winery, which was located at 9th and Morgan Streets. Just before he died, they purchased the Runyon House on B Street in what is now the St. Rose Preservation District. This impressive two-story Italianate house was built in 1872 and appears to be the first house built in the neighborhood. And you can see it on that far right slide. It is the house to the left. As the downtown area started experiencing commercial expansion in the early 1900s, Augusta started purchasing homes in the path of development. It has been stated she was Santa Rosa's first preservationist, but her penchant for purchasing older homes and moving them onto her property might have had more to do with the fact that she was a widow and could use the relocated buildings to generate income as rentals. The first home she moved was in 1898. Her good friend, Dr. Boyce, passed away. Dr. Boyce was one of Santa Rosa's first doctors and over his career worked as the county hospital physician, a witness for the county coroner's inquests, and the president of the Sonoma County Medical Association. His home, seen here in the center photo, was built in 1874 and very similar in architecture to the Metzger home. Augusta purchased the home in 1903 for $1 and moved it 5 blocks from 3rd Street near the courthouse next to her house on B Street. And that is the house on the right in the far right photo. In the spring of 1906, Augusta purchased the ornate Stick Eastlake style mansion of T.J. Ludwig, moving it from B and 5th Streets to 429 8th Street. T.J. Ludwig was one of the city's most important pioneer builders, building 430 houses, including most of the elegant houses in Santa Rosa and all the brick blocks in Santa Rosa's downtown business area before his death in 1894. Unfortunately, the 1906 earthquake struck just after the Ludwig house was moved and not yet secured to its foundation, causing it to slip off, resulting in severe damage. And that's the middle photo you see here. After extensive restoration, it was used as a multifamily residence until a fire in 1983 burned it to the ground. In one of the more sensitive new developments built in the St. Rose district, an apartment built by Tom Stewart in 1992 used trim salvaged from the Ludwig house on the portion of the building facing the street. And you can see that in the right photo on this slide. So then Augusta, in the same year, purchased the Maple Boarding House. The Maple Boarding House was located at 5th and B Streets and was owned by Mr. P.H. Quinn. Mr. Quinn moved his family from the Humboldt area to Santa Rosa to run the Occidental Hotel downtown. In 1904, he purchased the Maple Boarding House on 5th and B. When the 1906 earthquake struck, the 2-story building was severely damaged. Augusta purchased the building and moved it to her property at 8th and A Street. She got permission to remove the upper story and had the home reconstructed as a 1-story multi-family rental. This is another one of the fabulous stick-style buildings that was unfortunately later torn down. And in its place, you can see on the right is an office building, which it actually does work well with the neighborhood and the design of the neighborhood, but don't we wish that these beautiful buildings were still here that were built by T.J. Ludwig. So the last building I'm going to talk about that was moved by Augusta Metzger is the house pictured here, built in the Carpenter Gothic style. This style took Gothic elements, steeply pitched roofs and arched windows, and applied them to homes built with wood. Originally purchased in 1871 by Augusta's husband, William Metzger, this house originally resided at the corner of 5th and B Streets. Or I'm sorry, 5th and Davis Streets. Augusta moved it to 548 A Street so she could build an apartment house on the 5th and Davis Street property. It is estimated this home was built in 1870 or earlier, so it is one of the oldest homes in the St. Rose district. At one point, this home was targeted for demolition, but luckily this didn't happen, although the exterior was slightly altered in the 1990s. And this home is still standing, so you can see it at 546 A Street if you walk the neighborhood. So as a postscript to Augusta, while Augusta was clearly instrumental in saving many historic buildings, she tended to irritate just as many people as homes she moved by bending, if not outright breaking, the rules while moving them. When she applied for a permit in 1902 to move a building on 5th Street, she was admonished by the city attorney for moving the home before the city council had a chance to actually approve the permit. While moving Dr. Boyce's house, Augusta gave instructions to 2 of her workers to cut big limbs from the shade trees in front of the Baptist church on B Street without the pastor's permission, resulting in legal action by the church trustees. Just 3 days later, and after her tree cutting men were arrested for the prior incident with the church, Augusta's contractor attempted to cut the trees of her neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. George Noonan, even though consent had not been given to do this. A fist fight broke out between the contractor and a bystander, and those trees were left unharmed. So let's move on to some other buildings that were moved into the St. Rose neighborhood by other people. In 1923, a 2-story home already in the St. Rose neighborhood was moved from B Street to 10th Street to make room for a 15-unit apartment house to be built. Completed in 1924 and known as the Rosemont Apartments, they were considered ultra-modern with electric heaters in every room and mahogany furniture and oriental carpets throughout. And that's the building you see on the right there. The home on the left is a home moved to 10th Street, and it's known to this day as Mableton Apartments, possibly a play on Mableton, spelled Mableton, the name for the McDonald Mansion. But this Mableton is spelled Mabelton because the first owner in its new location was Mabel Brush. And both these buildings, by the way, are still standing. What you won't see is on the center picture here, which is a clipping when the Rosemont Apartments opened up, that there are balconies below those 2 center windows, and those are no longer there. I'm not sure if they came down because of earthquake concerns, but at least the building is still standing. So the next building we'll talk about is the St. Rose Church Parish, their priest quarters. And the priest quarters were built in 1885. And this wonderful picture shows the priest quarters on the left and the old church, not the current church, in the center, and then Ursuline Academy on the right. At the time, in the 1920s, the number of priests had increased from 1 to 3, and space was getting tight in the old priest quarters building. So that building was moved by the church to the northwest corner of their property, which is at 10th and Washington Street. That's where their parking lot is now. And so obviously the structure is no longer there, but this allowed them to build the new handsome structure, which is still there, which was built in 1921 and is now known as the Bishop's Quarters, and stands right just south of the St. Rose Stone Church. So a few other structures were moved in the 1920 and 1950. We'll talk about these two. They're both on the 300 block of 10th Street. So the sweet little Italianate cottage on the left was moved from 3rd Street between A and B Streets to this block of 10th Street. And the newspaper article that describes this goes on to say, when driving along B Street these days, a bit of care must be observed. Otherwise, you'll find yourself in a cul-de-sac formed by a one-story frame cottage that almost completely fills the street from sidewalk to sidewalk. The cottage was started on its journey Wednesday from the Prince property on 3rd Street and will proceed along B Street to a destination in the Clute subdivision across 10th Street from the St. Rose Church. The lot was made vacant by the removal of the house will be occupied by a building erected by Prince for Paulson's department store. So that was in 1921. And then the house on the right, the attractive colonial revival home, was moved in 1950 or probably the late 40s. From Wallace Street, and Wallace Street is on the west side of the freeway. It no longer goes across. If you're familiar with this area, when the freeway came through, it severed all the streets that actually were one big neighborhood and created West End's neighborhood and the neighborhood around Ripley Street and our neighborhood, the St. Rose neighborhood. So many of the streets actually continue on each side of the freeway, which is very confusing for new people trying to find an address. But Wallace Street was truncated on the west side of the freeway. It does not come onto the east side of the freeway, and it is now a cul-de-sac. But luckily, this lovely home was saved and is now on the 300 block of 10th Street. So this house was moved from Rose Court. And you're probably asking yourself, where is Rose Court? I've never heard of that. Well, that's because 7th Street between B and Mendocino Street Avenue was once called Rose Court. And prior to that, it was called Miser Alley. So Rose Court was getting expanded. It was, when it became 7th Street, it had been enlarged to more lanes. And at the time that this house was moved in 1950, it was moved because Babe Wood wanted to put in a parking lot for his auto business. The house traveled down Ross Street to Mendocino Avenue to the 200 block of 10th Street. And unfortunately, the 200 block is one of the blocks that was destroyed by the freeway, or most of the 200 block was, so that it's probably more than likely that this house was ultimately demolished when the freeway came through. And the moving company on this will sound familiar because it was Christ & Christ Moving Company. So this next house is the incredible Shea house. Con Shea was a cattle baron, moving cattle from Texas to Idaho and Oregon starting in the 1860s. You can imagine what kind of a lifestyle that was, transporting cattle through several states back in the 1800s. He left his name on both states, Idaho's Con Shea Basin and Oregon Shaeville. He moved to Santa Rosa in 1897, where he became one of the largest property owners in town. He served as the vice president of the Savings Bank of Santa Rosa and owned several of the businesses in Santa Rosa's red light district. In 1890, he built the impressive residence you see pictured here on the left for his family. When he died in 1926, he was one of the wealthiest men in Santa Rosa. In 1950, one of the first fast food hamburger joints was to be built on the property where the house stood. To save Con Shea's house, it was purchased for $1 by W.C. Trowbridge. and moved from 526 Mendocino Avenue, where the Glasser Center is now, to its present location to prevent it from being torn down. During World War II, the house served as a rooming house for servicemen and their families and is still used as a boarding house today. As you can see in the center photo, a politician took advantage of the attention given the house while it was being moved and hung his banner on the home during the moving process. The last structure I'm going to talk about is a building that used to be the post office and is now the Sonoma County Museum. After the 1906 earthquake, local hop dealer C.C. Donovan wrote to James Knox Taylor, supervising architect of federal buildings, asking him to give priority to the construction of a new post office at 5th and A Streets. Finished in 1910, the Santa Rosa Post Office building is an example of classic federal architecture. Anyone who has been inside the museum knows how impressive the interior is. Local businesses provided a lot of the building material and labor. Henry Cronky of the Santa Rosa Planing Mills did the interior woodwork. J.C. Mailer Hardware installed the building's plumbing. And stone contractor George Riley was responsible for the Bedford stone columns and marble terrazzo floors. However, this remarkable building almost became the victim of the 1960s urban renewal program. City leaders made 3 attempts to have the building destroyed. Architect Dan Peterson led the campaign to save the post office by proposing that it be moved. In 1976, the Santa Rosa Redevelopment Agency agreed to pay $148,000 for the post office with the understanding that it would be moved to a new location and used as a museum. However, when the bids came in for the relocation, the lowest bid was an additional $500,000 over the estimated $250,000 to $400,000 cost already on the books. The high cost of relocation put the post office at risk again. One council member groused, "We are trapped into this enormous expense just because someone felt the building had architectural significance." Luckily, the newly formed Historical Museum Foundation was able to raise significant funds, which, along with other contributions from the likes of Henry Trioni, the estate of Fred Rosenberg, the Exchange Bank Foundation, and a donation loan from the mall developer Ernest Hahn, were enough to save the post office once again. On April 14th, 1979, the 10,000 square foot, 1,700 ton building began its 750-foot journey to its new location on 7th Street at the southern edge of the St. Rose District. Using a network of steel beams and rollers, a method believed used by the pyramid builders over 45 centuries ago, the building was moved just 25 to 40 feet a day, ultimately taking 75 days to reach its final destination. 6 years later, in 1985, the Sonoma County Museum opened its doors to the public. So now to end my presentation, we're just going to go through a quick little show of all the homes and buildings that were moved into the St. Rose neighborhood. Not maybe their exact paths that they were moved in, but just to give you some idea of how the homes were moved and how many came into the neighborhood and where they landed. And that would be the Dr. Boyce's house that just moved in. And now we have the Ludwig house. And the Maple boarding house. I may be off by one here. I'm going to say, nope, this looks right. The Carpenter Gothic house. And that's priest quarters that the church moved. And that's a priest quarters that the church moved. So I am off by one. And that I am going to stop trying to guess what these are because it's a long list. But that house is probably the Shea house. So, but the point being that all these homes and all these structures were moved into the St. Rose Historic District at one point, and quite a few of them are still standing. So the fact that the neighborhood was so close to downtown and had such a large amount of open land really benefited the preservation of historic structures in Santa Rosa. And we look forward to maybe some more homes getting moved in, certainly no more homes destroyed in the neighborhood. Because it is just a gem, and we encourage you to come and walk around. You can go on our website that was mentioned earlier, and you will see a walking tour of the neighborhood. Please feel free to come by and walk around. The neighbors are friendly, and we love to have people admire our homes.
Denise, that was chock full of information about the St. Rose Historic District. Thank you so much for a great presentation, and so much history in there. It makes me want to go out for a walk right now and actually, go and see each of those homes that are still here. In fact, just earlier today, I walked by the house that Augusta Metzger had moved right next to St. Rose, right there on
Dr. Boyce's house. Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Boyce's house, but also on the other side of that. So on A Street, that very
the Gothic house.
yeah, beautiful, right? I mean, now knowing the story, it's just even better. So I want to invite those folks that are joining us now on Zoom and simultaneously on Facebook Live to go ahead, key in your questions. I know that this presentation maybe brought up a lot of questions. Some of you have been longtime residents or have generations of family members that have been in this area and maybe want to find out a little bit more about the St. Rose neighborhood, about moving homes. Go ahead and key in your questions on Zoom. You can do that in our chat area, and on Facebook, you can key in your questions in the comments. So you're getting some praise here, Denise. Roy is here, and he said, you are an absolute treasure, just like those houses that were moved into the St. Rose area. So thank you again for this presentation. Also, Mitchell said that he enjoyed the presentation very much. Great job. And is this presentation available? Yes, this presentation, great question, George. This presentation and all of our presentations by the Historical Society of Santa Rosa are available. They are recorded and they are available on the YouTube channel. So if you aren't familiar with YouTube, just go ahead and go to the Historical Society's website, and from there you can click on the YouTube logo and it'll take you over to the YouTube page, and you will see a bevy of videos that started back in October of 2020. Actually, our first video was the secrets of cemeteries here in Santa Rosa with Jeremy Nichols, and some exciting news coming up about that. Remind me to bring that up a little bit, but check out YouTube, and within just about 24 hours or so, even this presentation will be uploaded on YouTube as well. So if you came in a little bit late, or you have friends or neighbors or maybe a workmate that has talked about the St. Rose area or downtown and houses moving, they didn't believe that houses got moved and they didn't know which ones, this is a great presentation to send them to go watch on YouTube. So thanks again, George, for that question. And as more questions come in on Zoom and on Facebook, I'm going to ask you one of my questions that I had. Are you familiar, because we've had a presentation about Highway 101, right? And about, kind of traversing through the middle of downtown. There was an article in the Press Democrat today, I believe, that talked about why Highway 101 goes through the center of town instead of kind of going on the outskirts like some other municipalities. But as that happened and houses were having to either be demolished or potentially moved, are you familiar? Is the Historical Society familiar? Do you have resources about other houses that maybe were moved outside of the area of St. Rose? Because St. Rose wasn't the only area that houses were moved to, correct?
Right, right. And I've been researching this for a long time, and I probably have about 50 homes that I have located that were moved. It's interesting that the Public Works, State Public Works report on the freeway states 90 were moved, because I certainly haven't found 90, and just, that would just be in one window of time. But I have found quite a few, and I would direct people to the city's cultural resource survey of homes, because it does state on the individual in the historic districts and historic neighborhoods, it does list on the analysis of each home whether or not they think it was moved or they know it was moved. So that's always a good start. And then exciting for me anyway, is that the history annex of the library, Sonoma County Library, just got 2 books that are available online, and they are the permit records from the 1920s through the 1930s. And most of these homes, the way you find out that they're moved is off permit records, and the fact that it'll state they're moved. And I have spent a lot of time, probably too much time, searching permit reports in the local newspapers back to the 1800s. But to have all the records in one place is great. And if you reach out to them, they literally just got this like in the last week. Wow. So it's, it's a great resource.
Yeah, that's a great, well, you're a great resource to know that that's there now. So thanks for sharing that information with all of us. And, knowing that too, I remember when Margie from Sonoma State University was with us, and she was talking about the Highway 101 move. And that actually, for those of you that want to reference that on YouTube, that one is called The Lost Stories of Highway 101. So it's kind of an archaeological a dig into those stories of the different houses, or things that moved away from where the highway had been and why the highway had gotten there. So that's a good one to watch on that YouTube channel. But I remember that she talked about not all information is known, right? So you're saying that the state had a number of 90 houses that they say were moved, and you're right now at number 50 that you've been able to research and find information for. What she was saying is that sometimes not all the information lines up, and you can't necessarily research and find the facts. They didn't have the web back then, so right. It's not all right there at your fingertips.
It's a needle in the haystack. And the other resource, specifically for the highway coming through, are the Caltran records that were saved by somebody, thank goodness, and sent to Sonoma State. And those records right now are available by appointment, I believe. But it actually details each house and what the state was willing to pay for it, and describes the house, and there's photos. So this is going back in the late 1940s. So it's really a treasure trove of information. Yeah, I've gone, like I had shown in one of the slides. I mean, there are people moving houses and buildings all the way back to the very early days of Santa Rosa. So if you can imagine, and if the Christ family feels like they moved over 10,000 structures, and of course that's all over Sonoma County, I'm sure, you can imagine how many homes and how common it was at the time to be moving them back in the day.
Yeah, definitely. And George brings up a question right now around the hospital, Santa Rosa General. He was born at. So, and do you know what's happening with that building? That's I'm gonna let you go from there.
Yeah. It was built there. It was called a bungalow hospital. And if you look at it, if you stand outside and look at, because it's currently the Catholic Charities Family Service Center on A Street, it looks like bungalows. And it was very state of the art when it opened up. Unfortunately, the city has given Catholic Charities and Burbank Housing permission to tear it down so they can expand their new buildings into that area. And I believe apartments into that area. So it's probably short-lived in the sense of in the next 5 to 10 years, it will no longer be there.
So George, give Catholic Charities a phone call if you want one last, kind of skip through that building and visit your birthplace. I would imagine Catholic Charities might get a few of those phone calls in the next couple years while their doors are still open in that building where Santa Rosa General was, that people want to reminisce, maybe 1 or 2 times. Might be a little challenging right now with COVID. You might be asked to wear a mask. I don't know what their rules are there, but it's worth a phone call. It's part of Santa Rosa history. Take your photo outside the building and revisit a little bit. So George says, thanks for that information. And another question here from Catherine. Are there any members of the Christ family still around? And if so, do you know if they have any records that we can gain access to?
That's a great question and actually a great idea. I studied them, I researched them all the way from the early 1800s all the way up to about the 1960s. So I haven't gone any further than that. But yeah, great question. Definitely worth a look. And now I'm going to have to put that on my list.
Right? Yeah. And, I mentioned that earlier about the Catholic Charities. By all means, they are running programs there and we want to be respectful of their programs. But I still think asking a question is never harmful, right? And they're going to get that question no matter whether I ask that or not. So, and they can come up with a good answer. So talking about the St. Rose area, and you talked about walking through the St. Rose area. It's one of my joys, walking with my husband, my dog, seeing neighbors, seeing different things people are doing in their yards and looking at the homes, right? And you are in charge of the neighborhood website. And if I remember right, there is somewhat of a tour guide right there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a tour posted on there on the website that you can access if you'd like to. There's also just about every building in the neighborhood, housing and commercial, are photographed, and there's information on each one of them with a photograph. So it gives you some idea of when they were built and who might have owned them. Whatever we know, whatever we've researched and know, we try to put in there. So yeah, please take a look at the website and please avail yourself of the walking tour.
Yeah, and people can sign up to receive the newsletter as well, right?
Well, we actually don't do a newsletter anymore. What we do is we do posts, so more or less informational blogs. Or what I've done is I've transferred a lot of history onto the website, so you can just read it at your leisure. If I have new history, I will send it out off the website, off whoever subscribes to the website. So if you're interested in that history, you're probably going to get in between that information about city meetings and other things, but you'll also get any information if I post new history about a place or a person in our neighborhood. You'll get that sent to you also.
That's great. That's great. Great resource right there. And one that I would think is somewhat of a model for some of the other neighborhoods in Santa Rosa, historic district or not, to look at and how to kind of build community around information in your neighborhood. So speaking of that, how you talked about 25 years of researching. So what was the nugget that got you to start this, and was this envisioned that 25 years later you would still be researching and going down this path? Is
Yeah,
that something that you just never thought about?
it's really become a labor of love, but I think it started just because we loved older homes. We had a heck of a time um, finding our house because at the time, and this was way back in the early 1990s, we had real estate agents who kept dragging us to track homes, and it was not what we wanted. And I didn't know why I didn't want that, but I was raised in an older home, and both my grandparents had older homes, and I think I just knew what good architecture and interesting architecture looked like. So when we finally found our home in the St. Rose neighborhood, it was like, yes, this is what we're looking for. This is it. Let's take it. And so we have a little bungalow, and a very charming little bungalow in the neighborhood. And then eventually, once we got past all the new house projects, we got to a point where I was looking around and thinking, well, what is the story on this neighborhood? And the city had already done a pamphlet, a walking tour pamphlet. So that was a good starting point. But there were so many other stories, and their pamphlet really mostly spoke to architecture, which is great, but it didn't speak to the people who had lived in the homes and their stories. So I just started collecting their stories and adding it to the website. And they're all fantastic. I mean, you start digging into them and it's just amazing. I mean, just the story of Cornelius Shea's home. I mean, what an incredible history to have, herding cattle, from Texas up north through several states in the 1860s. I can't even imagine. So I went from there, and then we got even crazier. My husband and I started collecting vintage postcards of Santa Rosa, and we probably have about 1,000. And so we do have our vintage postcard, which is a lot of times real photo postcards. So you get to see a slice of the community that normally no one would take pictures of. A lot of times people took pictures of their homes and sent them to their friends and family. And so we've got quite a few of those, and those would be from the 1910s and 1920s, maybe at the latest. So yeah, there's just a lot of information out there. You have to do a little digging, but if you're passionate about it, it doesn't feel like work.
Yeah, well, great stories. And it makes me think of, there's whether it be postcards or, little something that architecturally, you said of that one house that there was an architectural piece that was used
Yes.
later on.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
to keep the history alive, right?
Right.
Keep stories going, and one way to keep those stories going is to visit the St. Rose Historic District website. And we have a question from Kathleen. What is that website called?
So it's ST. It's a Saint www.st Rose District. So StRoseDistrict.org. So it's org at the end.
Yep. And it is different than the Historical Society of Santa Rosa's website. So Denise, just for those of you that maybe joined us a few minutes after we started, I mentioned at the beginning that Denise Hill is a board member of the Historical Society of Santa Rosa, and she is a long-term resident homeowner here in the St. Rose Historic District, and runs the website for the St. Rose Historic District. So many hats that you wear. And the Historical Society's website, by the way, is just their name, historicalsocietysantarosa.org. So you can, both of those websites are enormous resources for those people that want to start diving into the history of either St. Rose Historic District or the history of Santa Rosa as a whole. So you're going to find lots and lots of information there. Speaking of lots of information, I'm going to go ahead and bring up our next slide, which is our last slide here of our next webinar. So our next webinar, we are bringing back Mr. Jeremy Nichols, and he actually was our presenter of the first webinar in 2020, and that was in October, the hidden secrets of the Santa Rosa cemeteries. And now he's going for it again, the hidden cemetery on Hidden Valley Drive. And that's going to be on Thursday, August 19th. And that'll again start at 6 p.m. right here on Zoom. The information will be coming out soon on the Historical Society of Santa Rosa's website, which you can see that website down at the bottom of the page right there in that slide. And it will also come out on Facebook, and you can sign up. If you sign up and you're here, you're joining us on Zoom, you're participating, you can ask your questions during Q&A on our chat area. If you have kind of walked by or scrolled by the Historical Society of Santa Rosa's page and were intrigued by the presentation on Facebook Live that's happening simultaneously, you can enter in your questions there on the comment section, and they will be relayed to us here. And of course, this presentation and all of the presentations that the Historical Society of Santa Rosa has presented, Jeremy's back in October, as well as those that have been throughout 2021, will be uploaded, and they are uploaded on the YouTube channel. So make your way to historicalsocietysantarosa.org, the website, and go ahead and check out the YouTube channel where all of these presentations are. And we have more presentations throughout all of 2021. So as we start to come back together and be able to go to events outside of our homes and off of Zoom, the Historical Society has decided that they're going to continue with these presentations and webinars and on Zoom itself. So we'll be seeing each other every month. And Denise, it's been a pleasure here. I think, no, I don't see any other questions this evening, but it's been a pleasure. Do you have any other parting words that you'd like to give us about the St. Rose Historic District, or some of your research? Any other resources you'd like to share with us?
I would just say that the History and Genealogy Annex of the library is a great resource for anybody who's doing research. If you go and talk to the staff there, they're very knowledgeable, and they can get you pointed in the right direction for sure. And again, just an open invitation, come and walk the neighborhood. There's 6, I think, historic neighborhoods circling downtown, and they're all a little bit different, and they're all very walkable. So please come by and enjoy the historic neighborhoods of Santa Rosa.
Great point about the fact that there's 6 neighborhoods that are historic districts. I was just visiting that page the other day because I was like, wait, what are the 6, right? But if you go to the City of Santa Rosa's website and you put in historic districts, you can find information about each of those districts. You can find a map of where those districts are, and it'll show them outlined. It will show the St. Rose Historic District as well. And it'll also show some of the, information about how to become a historic district. If those of you that are joining us tonight are in a neighborhood with homes that you think might qualify, and you want to get your neighbors together and pursue that option, all the information is there on the city's website as well. So thanks again, Denise, for putting together all of that great information for us. I think I'm going to go for a walk. Seems like a good evening to do it. The sun's still out, so I might see you in the neighborhood.
You bet.
All right, and thanks everybody again for joining us live on Zoom and simultaneously live on Facebook. Remember, next month on August the 19th, that's a Thursday, we'll be right here live once again for the Historical Society of Santa Rosa will bring you the Hidden Cemetery on Hidden Valley Drive, presented by Jeremy Nichols, starting at 6 p.m. And we'll be wrapping up probably that one. I have a feeling it's going to go until 7:30. We're ending a little early right now because I have a feeling we might even see some of our attendees out on our walk tonight. Denise, they might all just drive over here, and we'll just have a little block party. Why not after this?
That's right.
This Zoom webinar. So we hope to see you in our neighborhood again. For Denise and I, we're going to say good night. Thanks everybody for joining us. See you next month. Good night.